At 5:12 a.m., my HOA president dumped poison into my lake, not knowing it fed the entire neighborhood's drinking water. I was on my dock, rod in hand, when I heard high heels on gravel. Sandra Kirkpatrick, designer jacket, clipboard under her arm, a bag of copper sulfate in her hand. The moment she poured it in, the air turned sharp and metallic. Within hours, the first base floated to the surface. Stiff, silver, dead. I held one in my hands when she looked at me, smiled, and said, "It's just algae control. This is a decorative pond now." Then she drove off. What Sandra never checked was where the underground limestone springs from my lake actually led. And by the time I finished documenting everything, the entire HOA was already drinking it. Stay with me, because the next call I made turned this into a federal case. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And hit subscribe if you love watching Karens get what's coming to them. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. My name's Dale Hutchinson, I'm 58, and I spent 30 years keeping America's drinking water safe as a treatment plant supervisor. When I retired in 2019, my wife Sarah and I moved to this little slice of heaven called Pine Haven Subdivision, built in 1987 around the most beautiful spring-fed lake you've ever seen. We paid a premium for the lot with water frontage, specifically because I owned the fishing rights. Every morning for 20 years, Sarah and I would cast our lines at sunrise. It wasn't just fishing. It was our church, our therapy, our sacred time together. I've got faded photos of Sarah holding trophy base, both of us grinning like teenagers. When cancer took her 3 years ago, that lake became my only connection to her memory. Here's what most of the newer residents don't understand about Pine Haven. We're not on city water. Those 47 houses get their drinking water from private wells that tap into the same underground limestone aquifer that feeds our lake. The old-timers knew this, but newcomers just turn on the tap and assume it's municipal water. Big mistake. Enter Sandra Kirkpatrick, stage left with all the grace of a freight train. Moved here from Atlanta 18 months ago, bought the biggest house on the block, and immediately ran for HOA president. Sandra's a luxury real estate agent with perfectly manicured nails and an Instagram obsession. Everything she sees gets filtered through one lens. Does this hurt property values? To Sandra, fishing is trailer park behavior. The lake isn't a living ecosystem. It's decorative landscaping like a giant bird bath. She genuinely believed she could upgrade the neighborhood aesthetic by eliminating what she called redneck activities. The morning she poisoned my lake, I was dealing with my own health struggles. Diabetes had been kicking my butt lately, blood sugar spikes whenever stress hit. Fishing was doctor's orders, literally. But Sandra didn't care about doctor's orders. 5 a.m., April 15th. I'm threading a new lure when I hear her heels on asphalt. Sandra's got a 50-pound bag of algaecide and she's dumping it straight into the water. "This decorative water feature doesn't need rednecks making it ugly," she announces like she's reading a prepared statement. The smell hit first, that chemical burn of copper sulfate mixing with pure spring water. Then came the color change, crystal clear water turning toxic green within minutes. By noon, dead fish were belly up everywhere. Bass, bluegill, even the old turtle we'd named Winston. The water reeked of chemical death. I confronted her immediately. "Sandra, what did you just put in my lake?" "Pond maintenance," she snapped. "Calm down. It's just algae control." But there was no algae. The lake had been pristine. This was pure spite, wrapped in fake environmental concern. When I tried to explain that she'd just committed an environmental crime, Sandra laughed. Actually laughed. "It's a decorative pond, Dale. HOA property. Maybe if you spent less time fishing and more time reading the bylaws, you'd understand community standards." That's when I knew this wasn't ignorance. This was war. Sandra had declared war on my lake, my memories of Sarah, and my legal property rights. She just didn't realize she'd picked a fight with someone who understood water systems better than she understood real estate. The dead fish kept floating up for 3 days. Every single one felt like Sandra had slapped Sarah's memory across the face. But here's what Sandra didn't know. I document everything. 30 years in water treatment teaches you that. Photos, timestamps, water samples, chemical residue tests. I was building a case file while she was posting Instagram stories about neighborhood improvements. What Sandra really didn't know, what would eventually destroy her. was that her decorative pond fed the drinking water for every house in our subdivision, including hers. 2 days after the poisoning, Sandra escalated. Professional-grade, no fishing, decorative water feature-only signs appeared around the entire lake perimeter. Not cheap hardware store signs. These were metal, properly mounted, official-looking. Then came the certified letter. Notice of trespassing violation. The letter was 3 pages of legal-sounding nonsense. Sandra accused me of unauthorized recreational activities on HOA-managed property and threatened criminal trespassing charges if I continued fishing. My blood sugar spiked so hard I had to increase my medication dosage. Stress and diabetes don't mix, and Sandra knew exactly which buttons to push. But here's where Sandra made her first tactical error. Those signs weren't just on HOA common area, they were planted on my private land. She'd marked territory she didn't own, like a dog peeing on someone else's fence post. Time for some good old-fashioned document research. I drove to the county courthouse and pulled every paper related to Pine Haven subdivision. Original plat from 1987, my property deed, survey maps, environmental impact studies, the works. Cost me $43 in copy fees, but worth every penny. The smoking gun was buried in the subdivision's original covenant. Lake rights and water access shall remain with Lot 47 in perpetuity, including all fishing, boating, and recreational privileges. That's lawyer speak for, this lake belongs to Dale forever, no matter what future HOA presidents think. I also discovered something fascinating. The HOA bylaws never mention lake management. Sandra had been operating on pure assumption and intimidation. She convinced herself that being HOA president meant controlling everything within subdivision boundaries. Wrong. Here's a knowledge nugget I learned from 30 years dealing with property disputes. Always request a certified boundary survey before any water rights conflict. Most people assume property lines match what they see, but legal descriptions trump visual boundaries every time. Translation: never trust someone else's interpretation of what they own. So I played it polite but firm. Removed every illegal sign, posted laminated copies of my property deed on each signpost, and sent Sandra her own certified letter with a surveyor's map highlighting her trespassing violation. The mini twist came when I contacted the original developer, now 78 and living in Sarasota. Harold confirmed everything. Lake ownership was specifically preserved because the community depended on its underground springs for well water. That lake is the heart of your water system, Harold told me. Anyone who messes with it is messing with everybody's drinking water. Sandra's response was predictably dramatic. She called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss my aggressive territorial behavior. But when I showed up with my documents, the room dynamics shifted fast. Turns out, when you have legal facts on your side, bullies lose their audience. This isn't about fishing, I explained to the packed room. This is about property rights and environmental protection. Sandra doesn't have legal authority over my lake, and she's already caused ecological damage with unsupervised chemical treatments. The kicker was watching Sandra's committee members, 3 newcomers who'd supported her lake control plan, realize they'd been fed misinformation. Longtime residents started speaking up, sharing memories of fishing with previous owners, explaining the water system connections Sandra didn't understand, but Sandra doubled down instead of backing down. We need professional management of this water feature, she declared, mispronouncing aquatic as aquatic while trying to sound scientific. That's when she announced her next move, hiring a professional aquatic consultant to evaluate lake health hazards. I could see the gears turning in her head. If she couldn't claim legal ownership, she'd manufacture safety concerns. The meeting ended with uncomfortable murmurs and nervous glances. People were starting to realize their HOA president didn't know basic property law. But Sandra's ego was too invested to admit error. She was doubling down on stupid, which meant things were about to get much worse before they got better. Walking back to my house that night, the smell of dead fish still lingered in the evening air. Sandra had killed my lake's ecosystem out of spite, tried to steal my property rights through intimidation, and now planned to weaponize fake science against me. But she'd also made a critical error. She'd picked a fight with someone who spent 3 decades dealing with water contamination, environmental violations, and regulatory compliance. Sandra thought she was playing politics. I knew we were heading into federal crime territory, The question was, how many more mistakes would Sandra make before she realized she was poisoning her own family's drinking water? Sandra's Lake Beautification Committee launched exactly 1 week later, complete with color-coordinated flyers and a Facebook group called Pine Haven Property Values Initiative. She recruited 3 like-minded neighbors who'd moved in within the last 2 years, all suburban transplants who saw the subdivision as an investment rather than a community. The committee's vision statement was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive real estate speak. Transform underutilized water feature into attractive community focal point through professional landscaping and responsible recreational guidelines. Translation: eliminate fishing, install fountain, fence off Dale's access. Their emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night with a PowerPoint presentation about safety and aesthetic improvements. Sandra had obviously spent hours on this thing: professional graphics, before and after mock-ups, even cost estimates for decorative fountains and perimeter fencing. The proposed fence would block my dock access completely and cut off the boat launch I'd used for 20 years. Worse, their fountain installation required completely draining the lake, which would destroy what remained of the ecosystem after Sandra's chemical attack. It was environmental vandalism disguised as improvement. But Sandra's real weapon was social manipulation. She'd been spreading rumors about my territorial behavior and unsafe fishing practices to newer residents. I started getting dirty looks at the mailbox. Parents pulled children away when I walked past. Sandra had turned me into the neighborhood villain for defending my own property. The community meeting was packed. 60-plus residents crammed into Sandra's living room. She'd arranged folding chairs theater style with her PowerPoint set up at the front like a corporate boardroom. The smell of Sandra's vanilla candles couldn't mask the tension in the air. I came prepared with my own presentation. Original subdivision documents, environmental studies from 1987, and photographs showing the lake's pristine condition before Sandra's chemical intervention. Before we discuss beautification, I said, spreading documents across Sandra's coffee table, let's review who actually owns what. The room went dead quiet. Room. Shuffle of papers, nervous throat clearing, the soft click of Sandra's fingernails tapping her clipboard. I showed them the original plat, the environmental impact study, and my grandfather clause preserving lake rights in perpetuity. Here's another knowledge nugget from my water treatment days. Environmental protection laws almost always trump HOA architectural restrictions, especially for pre-existing water features. The Clean Water Act gives individual property owners stronger protections than most people realize. Translation: federal environmental law beats local HOA rules every single time. Sandra's committee members started looking uncomfortable as I explained the legal reality. Mrs. Peterson, who'd been most vocal about fishing problems, quietly asked if she could see the original subdivision paperwork. Mr. Asher, Sandra's biggest supporter, suddenly remembered he had somewhere else to be. The mini-twist came when longtime resident Bill Rodriguez spoke up. Bill's lived here since 1989 and remembered the original developer's promises about lake access. Harold specifically told us the fishing rights would never change, Bill said. That was part of what we bought into. Other long-timers started sharing memories. Community fishing tournaments in the 90s, kids learning to cast from my dock, the annual bass contest that raised money for local schools. Sandra's narrative about inappropriate recreational activities crumbled in real time. But Sandra wasn't backing down. She pivoted to her final argument: professional environmental management. We need expert evaluation of potential health hazards, she declared, somehow managing to mispronounce ecosystem as ecosystem. That's when she announced her ace in the hole. Aquatic Solutions Professional would conduct a comprehensive lake evaluation within 2 weeks. The company representative would present findings at the next HOA meeting and recommend appropriate chemical treatment protocols. I'd never heard of Aquatic Solutions Professional, which immediately raised red flags. Legitimate environmental consultants usually have university affiliations or state certifications. But Sandra was nodding like she'd hired Harvard's marine biology department. The meeting ended with uncomfortable silence and scattered applause for Sandra's presentation. People filed out quietly, avoiding eye contact with both of us. The committee had planted seeds of doubt about lake safety, even though they couldn't challenge my legal ownership. Walking home that night, I noticed something troubling. Several neighbors had stopped watering their lawns. When I asked Mrs. Patterson why her garden looked dry, she mentioned her tap water had been tasting funny lately and her husband was buying bottled water for coffee. That's when the pieces started clicking together. Sandra's chemical treatments hadn't just killed fish. They'd been affecting the water quality that people were actually drinking. The underground spring system connected everything, and Sandra's algaecide was flowing straight into the community's wells. But Sandra didn't know that. She thought she was managing decorative landscaping, completely unaware that her beautification project was poisoning her own neighborhood's drinking water supply. Time to call in some real experts and find out exactly what Sandra had done to our water system. Aquatic solutions professional turned out to be a 26-year-old guy named Kyle who cleaned swimming pools for a living. I discovered this when I followed his pickup truck to 3 different houses where he was vacuuming leaves out of backyard pools. His professional aquatic consultation consisted of a clipboard, a pH test strip, and a laminated certificate from the Pool and Spa Association of Georgia. Kyle's comprehensive environmental assessment took exactly 14 minutes. He dipped his test strip, took 2 cell phone photos, and declared my lake a bacterial contamination hazard requiring intensive chemical treatment. His report was 3 pages of laser-printed nonsense with recommendations that would have killed every living thing in the water. But Kyle's fake credentials weren't my biggest problem. Sandra was using his professional report to convince neighbors that my fishing equipment spread dangerous bacteria. Anonymous complaints started appearing with the county health department. Parents forbade children from playing anywhere near the lake. Sandra threatened to involve state environmental authorities if I continued fishing. The whispered conversations at the mailbox stopped entirely. Nobody would make eye contact. I was being treated like a public health menace in my own neighborhood, based on the pool maintenance opinion of someone who couldn't spell ecosystem correctly. Time to fight fire with actual fire. I contacted the real county health department and ordered professional water quality testing from a certified environmental laboratory. Cost me $400, but I needed legitimate science to counter Sandra's fake expertise. While waiting for lab results, I did some research on Kyle's company. Aquatic Solutions Professional was registered as a pool cleaning service in Clayton County. Kyle's only certification was for maintaining chlorinated swimming pools. He had 0 training in natural water systems, aquatic biology, or environmental assessment. The county health inspector, Maria Gonzalez, agreed to visit after I explained the situation. Maria's been testing water quality for 15 years and could smell Sandra's chemical contamination from 50 feet away. "Someone's been dumping copper sulfate," she said immediately. "Way too much copper sulfate." Maria's preliminary tests confirmed what I suspected: copper levels 40 times higher than safe drinking water standards. The natural lake bacteria that normally filtered harmful microorganisms had been completely eliminated. Sandra's algae control had destroyed our natural water treatment system. Here's a critical knowledge nugget about water systems. Beneficial bacteria in natural lakes work like biological filters, removing harmful contaminants before water reaches underground springs. Kill the bacteria and you eliminate nature's free water treatment plant. Translation: Sandra broke our ecosystem's natural cleaning system and turned clean springs into poison pipelines. The mini twist came when Maria explained the broader implications. "This lake doesn't just affect fishing," she said, pointing to geological survey maps. "These underground springs connect to your entire subdivision's well water through limestone channels. Everyone who lives here has been drinking contaminated water for months." That hit me like a freight train. Sandra hadn't just poisoned my fishing spot. She'd poisoned the entire community's drinking water supply. Every tap, every shower, every cup of coffee. 200 people had been consuming copper-contaminated water because Sandra thought she was cleaning a decorative pond. The real county health report was devastating. Massive ecological damage, Federal Clean Water Act violations, and immediate health risks for anyone consuming well water in the subdivision. Kyle's recommendations would have made everything exponentially worse by adding more toxic chemicals to an already contaminated system. I presented Maria's findings at the next HOA meeting, along with documentation exposing Kyle's fake credentials. "Kyle's expertise is pool maintenance," I explained to the stunned crowd. "His chemical recommendations would turn our spring water into industrial waste." Sandra's response was predictable. She claimed my tests were biased because I'd hired the laboratory myself. She actually accused me of manipulating results to make her look bad, as if I could bribe certified chemists to fabricate water contamination data. But the damage was done. Parents started demanding independent water testing for their families. Mrs. Asher mentioned her daughter's persistent rashes that doctors couldn't explain. Mr. Rodriguez realized his digestive problems coincided with Sandra's lake treatments. People were connecting their mysterious health issues to Sandra's chemical warfare. Sandra's final move was hiring a second consultant, this one claiming expertise in environmental remediation. I researched him immediately and found another pool maintenance guy, this time from Gwinnett County. Sandra was doubling down on fake science because she couldn't admit she'd poisoned her own neighborhood. The evening after exposing Kyle's credentials, I sat on my dock watching the sunset reflect off water that still carried the faint green tint of Sandra's chemicals. Dead fish had stopped floating up, but the ecosystem remained broken. What should have been a thriving spring-fed lake looked like an abandoned swimming pool. That's when I made the decision. Sandra needed to understand exactly what she'd done, not just to my property, but to every family in Pine Haven. Time to show her the connection between her decorative pond and everyone's drinking water, including her own. The county's comprehensive water quality report arrived on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. 47 pages of technical data, geological surveys, and contamination analysis that painted a picture Sandra never could have imagined. Her copper sulfate treatments hadn't just killed fish. They'd been systematically poisoning the limestone aquifer that supplied drinking water to every household in Pine Haven subdivision for 8 months straight. Every single well was contaminated above federal safety limits. Every family had been drinking toxic water, including Sandra's. I spread the geological survey across my kitchen table and traced the underground spring system with my finger. It looked like an underground highway network, natural limestone channels carrying water from the lake's spring sources to 47 different wellheads throughout the community. Sandra's decorative pond was actually the recharge point for our entire water supply. The timeline was devastating. Sandra's first chemical treatment in August perfectly matched when neighbors started reporting funny-tasting water. Her September algaecide application coincided with the Asher family's daughter developing unexplained rashes. October's intensive treatment aligned with a cluster of digestive problems among subdivision children. But the most shocking revelation was Sandra's own family health records. Her 12-year-old daughter Emma had been hospitalized twice for unknown toxicity, symptoms perfectly matching chronic copper poisoning. Sandra's husband Richard had developed memory problems and tremors that their family doctor couldn't explain. Sandra herself showed classic signs: green-tinged fingernails, hair loss, and cognitive impairment. They'd been drinking the most contaminated water in the subdivision because their well was closest to the lake's primary spring outlet. Sandra had been slowly poisoning her own children while believing she was improving property values. The technical data was clear. Copper compounds bind to limestone and concentrate over time. Each chemical treatment made the contamination worse, not better. Sandra's 8 months of beautification had turned our natural water treatment system into a poison delivery network. I called the original subdivision developer Harold, now 78 and living in Florida. "That lake system is 200 years old," Harold explained over the phone. "Limestone springs naturally filter groundwater through beneficial bacteria colonies. Kill the bacteria, and you've destroyed the community's primary water source." Harold confirmed what the geological survey showed. Pine Haven was intentionally built around the spring system because it provided clean, reliable water without expensive municipal connections. The lake wasn't decorative landscaping, it was the community's life support system. The power dynamics had completely shifted. Sandra wasn't just violating my property rights or killing fish for spite. She was committing federal environmental crimes with community-wide health consequences. The EPA considers groundwater contamination a serious felony, especially when it affects residential drinking water supplies. But here's what made Sandra's situation truly tragic. She genuinely didn't know. In her mind, she'd been cleaning a decorative pond to improve neighborhood aesthetics. She had no idea that her algae control was flowing directly into her daughter's drinking water, her husband's morning coffee, her own daily shower. The emotional weight hit me hard. This wasn't just about vindication or property rights anymore. Sandra had unknowingly tortured her own family for 8 months while trying to stop me from fishing. Her daughter's hospital visits, her husband's declining health, her own mysterious symptoms, all self-inflicted through environmental ignorance. I had evidence of federal Clean Water Act violations, endangerment of public health, and systematic contamination of community drinking water. Sandra's continued chemical treatments made her criminally liable for everything that followed. She was facing potential federal prison time for environmental crimes she didn't even realize she was committing. The question wasn't whether to go after Sandra legally. The EPA would handle that once they saw this data. The question was whether to save her family by stopping her next planned treatment or let justice take its natural course. Sandra was scheduled for one final comprehensive lake treatment the week before our community's summer pool party. Time was running out. My water treatment background taught me that stopping environmental crimes requires overwhelming evidence and perfect timing. Sandra needed to understand her devastation in the most public, undeniable way possible, and I had exactly the tools to make that happen. First, the physical preparation. I installed hidden water flow monitoring equipment at 3 underground outlet points where the lake's springs connected to the subdivision's well system. These weren't amateur devices. I used professional-grade sensors that could track contamination in real time and project the data onto large displays. The monitoring system worked like this. Sensors detected copper levels in the water flowing from lake springs into limestone channels. Digital displays showed contamination flowing underground in bright red streams, with real-time readings of toxicity levels. Anyone could watch poison traveling from Sandra's decorative pond directly into their kitchen faucets. For visual impact, I built a portable demonstration using clear tubes and colored water to show how underground springs connect multiple wellheads. The geology was actually simple once you saw it mapped out, like a hidden plumbing system, where one contamination source affected 47 different outlets. Legal strategy came next. I filed a formal EPA complaint with 8 months of documented violations, unauthorized chemical discharge, contamination of drinking water supplies, and endangerment of public health. The EPA takes groundwater contamination seriously, especially when children are involved. Federal environmental crimes carry mandatory minimum sentences that state courts can't reduce. I contacted environmental attorney Jessica Walsh, who specialized in Clean Water Act enforcement. Jessica reviewed my evidence and water quality reports, then delivered sobering news. Sandra faced potential federal prison time, unlimited financial liability for cleanup costs, and lifetime monitoring requirements for affected families. The financial calculations were staggering. Emergency well replacement for 47 households, $340,000 at $7,200 per house. Medical testing and treatment for copper poisoning, $150,000 estimated. Lake ecosystem restoration, $50,000 for proper biological rehabilitation. Sandra's potential legal exposure exceeded $540,000, plus EPA fines up to $75,000. Here's a knowledge nugget about environmental liability. Under federal law, contamination costs follow the polluter regardless of intent or knowledge. Even accidental groundwater poisoning triggers full financial responsibility for cleanup and medical expenses. Translation: Sandra would pay for every penny of damage whether she meant to cause it or not. Alley recruitment was easier than expected. 23 families had children showing copper poisoning symptoms. Parents were demanding answers about mysterious health problems that doctors couldn't explain. Once they understood the lake connection, they became fierce advocates for accountability. Dr. Patricia Kim, the pediatrician treating most of the affected children, agreed to present medical evidence linking health problems to water contamination. Her data showed perfect correlation between Sandra's treatment schedule and symptom onset in local kids. Maria Gonzalez from County Health would coordinate with EPA investigators for maximum regulatory impact. Local news reporter David Asher had been following water quality stories and wanted exclusive coverage of environmental enforcement actions. Technical preparation required explaining complex hydrology in simple terms that 60-year-old homeowners could understand immediately. I practiced until I could describe limestone aquifer systems in under 2 minutes. Underground springs work like hidden plumbing, poison the source, poison everything downstream. The timeline coordination was critical. Sandra had scheduled her final comprehensive treatment for the morning of our next HOA meeting. She planned to eliminate remaining fish and prep the lake for fountain installation before the community's summer pool party. Perfect timing for maximum irony. Sandra would poison the water right before families gathered for swimming and barbecues. The visual of contaminated lake water flowing into community wells while children played nearby would create unforgettable impact. EPA investigators agreed to position themselves with emergency equipment and federal arrest warrants. County health officials prepared emergency water distribution for affected families. Everything would converge at Thursday night's HOA meeting for Sandra's final public appearance as president. My emotional preparation was harder than the technical work. This wasn't just about fishing rights anymore, it was about protecting 200 neighbors from someone who didn't understand the damage she was causing. Sandra genuinely believed she was improving the community while slowly poisoning everyone's children. The cruel irony was that Sandra's own family suffered most. Her well was closest to the primary spring outlet, so Emma and Richard had received the highest copper doses. Sandra had tortured her own daughter for 8 months while thinking she was creating a better neighborhood. But I couldn't let sympathy override justice. Sandra's ignorance didn't excuse 8 months of federal environmental crimes. Her continued chemical treatments proved she'd learned nothing from previous contamination warnings. She was determined to beautify the lake regardless of ecological or health consequences. Thursday night would bring Sandra face to face with the full scope of her environmental destruction. 47 families deserved clean water. 23 children deserved healthy futures. And Sandra deserved to understand exactly what her property value improvements had cost the community she claimed to serve. The trap was set. Time to let Sandra spring it herself. Sandra's final algae elimination treatment was scheduled for 6 a.m. Thursday morning, 48 hours before the community's annual summer pool party. She'd purchased industrial-grade copper compounds from an agricultural supply store, enough chemicals to treat a 100-acre commercial lake. For our small spring-fed pond, it would be environmental overkill of epic proportions. Her timing couldn't have been more tone-deaf. Families were preparing for the biggest social event of the year, kids excited about swimming competitions, parents planning potluck dishes, teenagers organizing volleyball tournaments. Sandra planned to dump toxic chemicals into their water supply right before everyone gathered to celebrate community. I filmed Sandra loading 50-pound chemical bags into her BMW at the farm supply store, chatting cheerfully with the clerk about pond maintenance. She even posted Instagram stories about her beautification project final phase, hashtagging neighborhood goals and house property values. The disconnect between her social media confidence and environmental reality was staggering. But Sandra's own health was deteriorating rapidly. The copper poisoning symptoms that she'd blamed on stress were becoming impossible to ignore. Her fingernails had developed a distinct green tinge that makeup couldn't hide. Hair loss was visible despite expensive salon treatments. Memory problems affected her speech during neighborhood conversations. Most heartbreaking was watching Emma's condition worsen. Sandra's 12-year-old daughter had been hospitalized twice in the past month for unknown toxicity, symptoms that perfectly matched chronic copper exposure. The pediatric toxicologist specifically recommended immediate water testing, but Sandra dismissed medical advice as overreaction to normal childhood illnesses. And Richard, Sandra's husband, finally confronted her about their family's declining health. I overheard their argument from my backyard, Richard shouting about Emma's medical bills while Sandra insisted their problems stemmed from negative energy and stress from dealing with Dale's harassment. The mini twist came when I discovered Richard had been secretly questioning Sandra's lake treatments. He'd researched copper sulfate toxicity online and found EPA warnings about groundwater contamination. But when Richard tried to discuss environmental concerns, Sandra accused him of siding with Dale against his own family. My documentation efforts intensified. I filmed Sandra's chemical purchases, recorded her dismissive responses to health concerns, and tracked her family's medical appointments through public records. Every piece of evidence would help EPA investigators understand the pattern of environmental crimes and family endangerment. County Health Department monitoring confirmed contamination was spreading beyond Pine Haven subdivision. Wells in neighboring Meadowbrook estates showed elevated copper levels, proving Sandra's chemicals were migrating through underground limestone channels. What started as lake poisoning was becoming regional groundwater contamination. Dr. Kim's pediatric data revealed 23 children across 2 subdivisions showing copper poisoning symptoms. The contamination timeline matched Sandra's treatment schedule with frightening precision. August chemicals coincided with digestive problems. September treatments aligned with skin rashes. October's intensive cleaning triggered neurological symptoms in several kids. EPA investigators arrived Wednesday evening, positioning themselves with federal arrest warrants and emergency water testing equipment. Agent Rodriguez explained they'd been monitoring our situation since my initial complaint, waiting for sufficient evidence to justify federal intervention. The bureaucratic process fascinated me. Environmental crimes require overwhelming documentation because cleanup costs can reach millions of dollars. EPA investigators needed proof of intentional ongoing contamination, not just accidental one-time spillage. Sandra's 8 months of systematic chemical treatments provided perfect evidence of willful environmental destruction. Thursday morning brought Sandra's final chemical assault. I watched from my kitchen window as she dumped 50 pounds of copper compounds into water that was already toxic. The lake turned bright green within minutes, so visibly contaminated that even Sandra seemed surprised by the color intensity. But Sandra pressed forward with her fountain installation plans. She'd hired contractors to begin drainage and excavation immediately after the chemical treatment settled. Her vision of a decorative water feature had become an environmental disaster that she was determined to complete regardless of obvious toxicity. The cruel irony was watching Sandra prepare for the pool party while poisoning the water source. She baked cupcakes for the community celebration while her chemicals flowed into every family's drinking water. The cognitive dissonance was almost supernatural, celebrating community while destroying community health. Richard's final attempt to stop Sandra failed spectacularly. He confronted her about Emma's latest hospitalization, begging her to consider that their daughter's illness might be water-related. Sandra responded by threatening divorce if he continued undermining her community leadership with Dale's conspiracy theories. That evening, Sandra posted final Instagram updates about successful lake renovation and exciting community improvements. Photos showed her bright green toxic pond with cheerful captions about enhanced property values. She tagged local real estate agents and invited potential buyers to see professionally managed amenities. Less than 12 hours later, Sandra would learn exactly what her professional management had accomplished for the community she claimed to serve. Sandra's final power play arrived Friday morning via certified mail. A restraining order claiming I was harassing community leadership and endangering public health through reckless fishing activities. The legal papers accused me of everything from trespassing to environmental terrorism, wrapped in 3 pages of official court language that made Sandra sound like a victim of my aggression. The restraining order was Sandra's nuclear option, designed to keep me away from Thursday night's HOA meeting where she planned to announce her comprehensive lake renovation victory. If I couldn't attend the meeting, I couldn't present evidence of her environmental crimes to the community. But Sandra's sworn affidavit contained multiple false statements that would destroy her credibility in court. She claimed legal ownership of the lake, denied any chemical treatments, and accused me of contaminating water through unsanitary fishing practices. Every sentence was either a lie or showed fundamental misunderstanding of property law. The judge granted a temporary restraining order, but scheduled an immediate hearing after reviewing my property documentation. Sandra's legal strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing me, she'd given me a court platform to present evidence of her environmental crimes with federal EPA investigators as witnesses. Meanwhile, Sandra's health had deteriorated to the point where neighbors were expressing genuine concern. The copper poisoning symptoms were impossible to hide: severe cognitive impairment, physical weakness, visible tremors during conversations. She still blamed her declining health on stress from Dale's negative energy, completely unaware that she was displaying textbook signs of heavy metal toxicity. Emma's condition reached crisis level Tuesday night. Sandra's daughter was rushed to the emergency room with severe copper toxicity symptoms that doctors couldn't initially explain. The pediatric toxicologist recommended immediate environmental assessment of their home, but Sandra refused testing, claiming Emma's illness was caused by school germs and emotional stress from family harassment. Richard finally threatened to call Child Protective Services if Sandra continued refusing medical advice about environmental testing. Their marriage was disintegrating under the weight of Sandra's delusions about water safety versus their daughter's obvious poisoning symptoms. The mini twist came Wednesday morning when Sandra received Emma's comprehensive blood work results during her final chemical treatment preparation. The pediatric toxicologist called with definitive copper toxicity diagnosis and mandatory reporting requirements for environmental poisoning cases. Sandra hung up on the doctor and continued mixing chemicals for her Thursday morning final beautification treatment. She was so deep in denial that medical evidence of her daughter's poisoning couldn't penetrate her conviction that the lake improvements were necessary and beneficial. EPA investigators positioned themselves around the subdivision with federal arrest warrants and emergency water testing equipment. Agent Rodriguez confirmed that Sandra would be taken into custody immediately after the HOA meeting, once her environmental crimes were exposed in front of community witnesses. Thursday afternoon brought Sandra's ultimate act of environmental destruction, dumping 50 pounds of industrial copper compounds into water that was already contaminated beyond safe limits. The lake turned fluorescent green, so visibly toxic that children playing nearby started asking parents why the pond water looked like slime. But Sandra posted cheerful Instagram stories about her successful final treatment phase, complete with hashtags about #property maintenance and #community leadership. The disconnect between her social media celebration and obvious environmental disaster was genuinely frightening to witness. Local news reporter David Asher arrived early to film the HOA meeting, having been tipped off about environmental enforcement action in suburban subdivision. His camera crew was positioned to capture Sandra's reaction when she learned about her family's poisoning. The evening's setup was perfect from a dramatic perspective. Sandra confident in her legal restraining order, planning to announce fountain installation success while EPA agents waited outside with handcuffs. The community gathering for their annual pool party celebration, unaware that their HOA president had been poisoning their drinking water for 8 months. Dr. Kim arrived with medical evidence from 23 affected children, ready to present copper toxicity data that perfectly correlated with Sandra's treatment schedule. County Health Inspector Maria Gonzalez brought contamination reports showing federal environmental violations that couldn't be dismissed as phishing harassment. Sandra entered the meeting carrying a fresh chemical treatment container as evidence of responsible property management, planning to demonstrate her commitment to professional lake maintenance standards. She had no idea she was bringing the murder weapon to her own environmental crime trial. 200 residents packed the community center, many dealing with mysterious health problems they'd blamed on everything except their drinking water. Parents brought sick children, hoping to understand why pediatricians couldn't explain their symptoms. Sandra's final moments of power were about to collide with 8 months of environmental evidence and federal criminal charges. The decorative pond she'd been beautifying was about to reveal itself as the community's poisoned water source, and Sandra was about to learn she'd been slowly killing her own daughter while trying to improve property values. Sandra called the HOA meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., confident in her restraining order protection and ready to celebrate her successful lake renovation project. She'd arranged the community center like a corporate presentation, with her laptop connected to a large screen for showing before and after photos of her beautification achievements. 200 residents packed beyond capacity, parents holding children with mysterious rashes, elderly couples dealing with unexplained digestive problems, teenagers complaining about weird-tasting water that adults had dismissed as teenage drama. Everyone had health concerns they couldn't explain, but nobody had connected their problems to Sandra's lake treatments. I activated my water flow monitoring display as Sandra opened the meeting with cheerful announcements about property value improvements and professional environmental management. The large screen behind her began showing real-time contamination flowing underground, bright red streams of poison traveling from the lake directly into every household's well system. The visual impact was devastating. Color-coded displays revealed copper toxicity 40 times above safe drinking water limits, flowing in real time from Sandra's decorative pond to 47 different homes. Numbers climbed steadily as fresh contamination from her morning chemical treatment reached the underground spring outlets. County Health Inspector Maria Gonzalez stood up first, interrupting Sandra's presentation with emergency water quality data. "Mrs. Kirkpatrick, your lake treatments have contaminated every well in this subdivision. Children have been drinking poison for 8 months because of your unsupervised chemical applications." Sandra's response was predictably defensive. "That's ridiculous. The lake is decorative landscaping. City water comes from municipal sources, not some pond." That's when Dr. Patricia Kim presented her medical evidence. 23 children across the subdivision showing classic copper poisoning symptoms. Hospitalization records, blood test results, and treatment timelines that perfectly matched Sandra's chemical applications. Emma Kirkpatrick had the highest toxicity levels because their well was closest to the primary spring outlet. The crowd erupted as parents realized their children's mysterious illnesses were caused by their HOA president's beautification project. Angry voices demanded explanations for medical bills, missed school days, and months of worried pediatrician visits that doctors couldn't explain. EPA agent Rodriguez stepped forward with federal arrest warrants and evidence of Clean Water Act violations. Sandra Kirkpatrick, you're under arrest for environmental crimes, including contamination of drinking water supplies and endangerment of public health. But the real devastation came when Sandra's phone rang during the arrest process. Emma's pediatrician was calling with definitive blood work results, severe copper toxicity, requiring immediate medical intervention and environmental remediation. Sandra answered the phone while EPA agents waited to handcuff her. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, your daughter has been systematically poisoned by heavy metal contamination in your drinking water. We need to identify the source immediately to prevent permanent neurological damage. Sandra's face went white as the realization hit. The display screen behind her showed contamination flowing directly from the lake to her house in real time. Her morning's chemical treatment was literally flowing into Emma's drinking water as we watched. I didn't know, Sandra whispered, staring at the monitoring display. I thought it was just decorative. That's when I delivered the mic drop moment that had been building for 8 months. Sandra, the lake you tried to beautify was designed by nature 200 years ago as our water treatment plant. You turned our life source into a poison delivery system, and you drank it yourself. The community center fell silent except for Sandra's shocked breathing and the quiet beeping of contamination monitors. Parents stared in horror as they understood their HOA president had been slowly poisoning their children while thinking she was improving property values. Sandra collapsed into a folding chair as EPA agents read her Miranda rights. The chemical treatment container fell from her hands, spilling copper sulfate across the floor, the same toxin that had been flowing into every family's drinking water for months. Local news cameras captured everything. Sandra's arrest, the real-time contamination display, parents demanding immediate medical testing for their children, EPA investigators seizing evidence of systematic environmental crimes. Dr. Kim announced emergency protocols for comprehensive medical screening of all affected families, with costs to be covered by Sandra's homeowner's insurance and personal assets. Children would receive ongoing monitoring for potential long-term effects of copper exposure. Maria Gonzalez declared the water supply unsafe for consumption and ordered immediate emergency bottled water distribution. The subdivision would need complete well replacement at estimated costs exceeding $340,000, all traceable to Sandra's 8 months of lake beautification. EPA agent Rodriguez confirmed federal criminal charges, multiple counts of environmental destruction, endangering public health, and contamination of drinking water supplies. Sandra faced minimum 18 months federal prison plus unlimited financial liability for cleanup and medical expenses. The meeting ended with Sandra being led away in handcuffs while parents surrounded Dr. Kim demanding immediate blood tests for their children. 200 families had just learned their HOA president had been slowly poisoning them while trying to stop one man from fishing. Justice had arrived, but the community's healing would take years. Sandra's environmental crimes resulted in the harshest penalties federal court could impose: 18 months federal prison, $75,000 EPA fines, plus $490,000 restitution for emergency well replacement and comprehensive medical monitoring for every affected family. Her homeowner's insurance covered initial cleanup costs, but personal assets were liquidated to fund ongoing health screening for the 23 children she'd unknowingly poisoned. The criminal prosecution moved swiftly once EPA investigators presented their evidence. Sandra's 8 months of systematic environmental destruction, documented through her own social media posts and chemical purchase receipts, provided overwhelming proof of federal Clean Water Act violations. Her sworn affidavit claiming lake ownership only strengthened the prosecution's case by proving willful disregard for property law and environmental regulation. Richard Kirkpatrick filed for emergency divorce and full custody of Emma, citing Sandra's endangerment of their daughter's health through environmental negligence. Emma's copper toxicity required 6 months of medical treatment, but doctors projected full recovery with no permanent neurological damage. The family relocated to Richard's parents' home in North Carolina, far from the subdivision Sandra had inadvertently turned into a toxic waste site. Community recovery began immediately, with emergency well replacement using Sandra's insurance settlement and liquidated assets. All 47 households received new wells with proper filtration systems and monthly water quality monitoring. The subdivision's property values actually increased once news coverage highlighted the comprehensive environmental remediation and upgraded water infrastructure. My lake restoration took 18 months of careful biological rehabilitation. County environmental specialists reintroduced beneficial bacteria colonies and native fish populations while monitoring water chemistry throughout the healing process. The ecosystem gradually returned to its pristine condition, supporting healthier wildlife diversity than before Sandra's chemical warfare. The HOA underwent complete restructuring with new bylaws requiring environmental impact assessments for any water feature modifications. Sandra's Lake Beautification Committee was permanently dissolved, replaced by an environmental stewardship council that includes certified water quality professionals and emphasizes ecosystem protection over aesthetic improvements. Legal precedent from Sandra's case strengthened environmental protection laws statewide. Her prosecution became a cautionary tale used in EPA training materials for identifying and prosecuting groundwater contamination crimes. Environmental law schools now study Kirkpatrick v. EPA as a textbook example of how homeowner association overreach can trigger federal criminal liability. I received unanimous HOA approval for permanent exclusive fishing rights, plus $35,000 damages for 8 months of property interference and emotional distress. But more importantly, I was named the subdivision's first environmental guardian with authority to monitor water quality and prevent future contamination incidents. The personal healing meant more than financial compensation. My morning fishing ritual returned with deeper appreciation for the lake's role in community health. Sarah's memory was honored not just through our private moments at sunrise, but through protecting the water source that sustained 200 neighbors. I established Sarah's Clean Water Memorial Fund at the local high school, providing college scholarships for students pursuing environmental science careers. The fund raises money through annual Clean Water Day festivals that bring families together for fishing tournaments, water quality education, and ecological awareness activities. 23 children received full medical monitoring through their 18th birthdays, funded by Sandra's restitution payments. Dr. Kim reports that early intervention prevented long-term health consequences, and most families now advocate for stronger environmental protection in residential communities. The lake has become a model for sustainable subdivision water management, attracting environmental science students from 3 local universities for field research projects. My monitoring system was donated to the high school's environmental program, where students learn about aquifer protection and water quality testing. Sandra's house remained unsold for 2 years before being purchased by a young family who specifically wanted to live in a community with outstanding environmental stewardship. The new owners removed Sandra's decorative landscaping and replaced it with native plants that support healthy lake ecology. Community bonds strengthened through shared recovery from Sandra's environmental assault. Neighbors who barely spoke before now organized regular water quality testing parties and environmental education events. Children who suffered copper poisoning have become passionate advocates for protecting natural water resources. This morning I cast my line at sunrise, watching crystal clear water reflect clouds that Sarah would have loved. Fish jump healthy in the early light, children play safely on the restored shoreline, and families drink clean water from wells that will never again be threatened by ignorant beautification. Speaking of water problems, you should hear about my neighbor who's been stealing irrigation from the city system for his drought-resistant landscaping. Turns out his water bills don't match his lush green lawn, and he picked the wrong former municipal inspector to steal from. Drop a comment with your worst HOA nightmare. We might feature your story next. And hit that subscribe button if you love watching environmental criminals face consequences for poisoning their own communities.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video. Drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.